Hi, this is Alan Gassman. Welcome to this webinar broadcast to talk about Hurricane Ian relief. I know a lot of you have had some horrendous situations, or you have family members or friends who have had horrendous situations. You have our condolences and our sympathy. Our office was unscathed, but some parents of employees and some property of employees were severely challenged. We had one family that had to put on life vests along with grandpa and swim from their home and hold on to a bank awning in Kissimmee and wonder whether an alligator was going to eat them. We have another employee whose parents completely lost their home and in Southwest Florida. So thank heaven that this storm was not nearly as bad as it could have been. I'm joined here by Karl Mill, who is a wonderful lawyer who specializes in charitable taxation and planning, and with my partner Ken Crotty, and with Peter Farrell, who is a student at Stetson Law School and has been doing a great job clerking with us. So one thing I'll mention, of course, this does not qualify for continuing education credit. If you have signed up for this, which obviously the attendees have, then you're going to receive an email pretty soon in about 2 to 3 hours that you can click on and hear this again, and you can forward it to a friend. If you have questions, you can click on the question inverted pyramid and type in your question, and at the end of the presentation, we'll go through the questions and we'll answer them to the best of our ability. You also have or will be receiving our Thursday report, which has articles on some of these topics. And I'm going to go here to Karl first and let him lead us through his slides. And Karl, I'll be glad just to move the slides as you tell me if you don't have control.
Okay, sounds good, Alan, and thanks for the introduction, and good to talk to everyone again. I'll acknowledge, like Alan said, our condolences go out to everyone affected. I'll also acknowledge this is a bit of, this is going to be a tax presentation about disaster relief. It seems like maybe a strange time to be talking taxes, but this is the rules that we're going to be talking about as they apply to charities are sort of rules that be helpful to understand as you or your company or your charity or your foundation want to do something to help mitigate the harm caused. So this is all, this is sort of tax law with a purpose here. Let me, don't think I have control yet, Alan, so I guess I'll go ahead, and if you could move the slide ahead one, perfect. Obviously we're talking about this because this is sort of perpetually timely to talk about disaster relief. I was going to have transitions, but I will just talk about it one at a time. I think the biggest reason when we talk to clients about disaster relief, there's always this fear in the background that the money they give is not going to go where it's supposed to go. So whether that's your company or you or a charity wanting to find a good place to send money, knowing it's going to help, that's part of what we're talking about here, and how to establish an organization that will do disaster relief the right way instead of having it be done the wrong way. It is becoming increasingly common, and I think in some cases even expected, that when these things happen, employers step up, certainly large employers step up for the communities they operate in. That'll often mean giving their own funds or gathering from employees, gathering funds for people impacted by disaster. Which brings up the third point, there's right and wrong ways to do this. There's ways to do this that can be really effective and helpful, and there's ways to do this that would, where these sort of strategies can backfire. So we want to understand the right way to do it. Lastly, when done right, there are, there's a tax efficiency and bonuses. There's sort of benefits to be understood by using a charitable vehicle to do this. We'll talk about exactly how that works in a minute and why. This is sort of what the charitable vehicles are for. I also want to call out something I did in two. Something people often don't understand is an option here. Is the idea that you can actually focus your disaster relief on particular categories of people. It doesn't have to be for everyone impacted by the disaster. It is possible to raise money for a specific group of people, and even the families of your employees and your employees themselves. Again, if it's done right. So to that end, by the time you're done, you hopefully sort of understand what the options are for giving in that way, for establishing a fund in that way, and so that we can go through here. I'm just trying to kill some background noise as well. I can. Excellent. So I think the next slide would be another sort of why are we talking about this now? I think obviously those of you in Florida, I'm calling from California. I know in Florida you just had a disaster, and in California we have multiple disaster seasons where there's fire season, there's earthquake season, there's just all sorts of disasters at all times. And this is sort of a rough chart I put together based on some rough data, but you'll see that these sort of number of federal disasters are going up over time. In California, you'll see, in the 80s and 90s, it was one thing, and now 2020, we had over 300 nationally declared disasters. That's almost a disaster a day. So we will be focused on how those can be, what that idea means, idea of federal disaster, and also how how the prevalence of this gives opportunity for this sort of setting up funds and planning. Real quick, this is what I'm going to try to cover in the time we have. These are sort of the key concepts. I also want to call out, like it says at the bottom, the IRS actually has a really good publication on this topic, called Publication 3833, that walks through the disaster relief. So these slides are available. Feel free to download, read over. And I also encourage you, if you're a tax preparer, if you have a company that's considering a fund, or you're individually thinking about making some gifts or doing some disaster relief work or creating a charity, it's a really good place to start to understand. I'm going to walk through what I think of as kind of the key principles and what I've learned in the course of advising nonprofits about disaster relief, what the key concepts are. So you can kind of see what the topics are there. We'll just jump right to the first one, which is sort of these options of how you can give to provide disaster relief. I don't know if you could flip the slide, Alan. It lets me. I can't do a presentation like this without creating a chaotic chart, and this is my one chaotic chart for the day. I'll kind of walk through what's going on in this chart. Let's start on the left side together. The left side, the leftmost option represents what sort of happens most of the time when a disaster happens and there's been no sort of planning as to how you might do disaster relief. You have the employer that might want to pay out some additional extra money to employees, and just say, okay, we're going to make additional payments to our employees and to their families to help them recover from this disaster, and we'll raise money together from the co-workers. So you'll see I have this kind of thumbs down, thumbs up matrix. I'll explain why they're the way they are. But let's say you're making the payments in the context of a disaster, and they're not what we're going to call 139 direct payments later. That means it's not a federally qualifying disaster and you haven't met certain safe harbors. You're just handing out money based on people you know have had a hard time. Well, anytime an employer pays money to their employee, it's assumed to be compensation, right? So then a couple of things happen. The employer has, you're making these payments, you're also going to pay additional payroll tax on those payments because it's payment to an employee. Just as unfortunately, you were trying to get $10,000 to their employee and they're going to receive $6,000, $7,000 because it's taxable income, unless an exception applies. Payments from an employer to an employee are compensation. So this is sort of why I have it as a thumbs down. It's not really an optimal way to go about it. On the coworker side, the good news is when people give money to other people, that is excluded from income. Just like when you receive money on your birthday, that is not taxable income for you. It's also not deductible to your grandmother, whoever it was that sent you the money. But it is, it's not deductible by those individuals and it's not income to you. So for sort of peer-to-peer fundraising, what you might think of as sort of GoFundMe disaster relief fundraising, you might see, these can work okay and then don't have any severe negative consequences. But as you'll see, as we move to the right, there are still better ways to do it. So sum up the first scenario, these are non-qualifying direct payments, no planning whatsoever, just handing out money. It's going to be treated as comp from the employer, and it's just going to be a regular old gift like any other from coworkers or other individuals. We go to the middle column. This is where the employer is paying enough attention to make sure the payments qualify under 139. We'll hear more about what that later means, but it means it's got to be a federally declared disaster, and you got to make sure you tailor your payments in the right way. If you follow those rules, the good news is that this isn't taxable income to the employee. No payroll taxes paid. They get the full 10,000. They're not stuck with the after-tax amount. So that's great. So as a starting point, it's going to be good to understand those 139 rules, just to see if there's a way to avoid that taxable income to the employee. And then for the coworkers, it's still the same result. Still just a gift, disinterested generosity, not included as income, and therefore, sorry for the background noise there. Not included as income and not deductible to the donors. Now, the premise of this presentation is you'll see, so in the middle we have one thumbs up. You go all the way right, we have 2 thumbs up across the board. The premise of this presentation is sort of the most efficient and tax efficient and therefore effective way. The way to get the most money to people in need is to find some sort of a charitable vehicle. And the good news is that there's ways to do that involving an employer, not just having it being a specific class. So you'll see in this scenario, when we do everything right, we have from the employer, okay, good news. 1, it's not going to be taxable compensation. 2, it's going to be a charitable contribution deduction. Now, if you really want to get in the weeds about whether it's better for an employer to take a business deduction or a charitable contribution deduction, we might find that the business deduction can be better. I'm still going to present this as favorable because now the employer gets to report a charitable contribution that can have a halo effect. If we talk about some of these options, there might be a company foundation that can be a positive way to build goodwill. So ultimately, still really good from the employer's perspective. They get to make payments. There's no compensation, no payroll tax. On the coworker side, now they get charitable contribution deductions to the gift, because there's no gifts for giving to your friend who's been hurt in a disaster, but there is a deduction for giving to a charity that might help people like your friend who hurt in a disaster. So we've sort of made this a better result for the coworkers you're raising money from as well. And as in the last case, employees and their families won't receive any taxable income for receiving money from charity. So this is really the best of all worlds, and why when we're talking about this, and as opposed to, you can always just hand out money, but if you want to hand out the most money most effectively, using a charitable vehicle might be the option. And with that, I'll pivot to the next slide and start to get, okay, we know it's great to have the charity, but with charity comes rules. That's why people like me exist. And let me talk about what some of those rules are. I will start with a basic principle, which is why is disaster relief charitable. I think for some people this seems self-explanatory, and it mostly is. It mostly works the way you would expect. You're providing relief to people from suffering, and one kind of charity is providing relief to the needy and distressed. People harmed as a result of a disaster are generally going to be people in a charitable class that deserve funding, and I'll talk about a little bit of an exception there. This extends to financial assistance. So disaster relief isn't just about pulling people out of the rubble, immediate medical need. It's also about so-and-so's home was destroyed, so-and-so's business was destroyed, so-and-so's source of income, and they're no longer able to feed or clothe their family. As a company, a charity can be established to provide some of those needs. But similarly, it can include financial assistance to businesses when you do it right. I'll go back to the when you do it right thing as an important part of this, because there is a way to do it wrong. Generally speaking, when charity and business intersect, you have things to think through. You have to think through things like, how do I know this charitable money is not going just to benefit local business? That's not a charitable purpose. That being said, even the IRS in this publication is saying there's ways in which can be charitable. If the business is owned by someone in financial need, financially distressed, that can be a reason to support the business. Lessening the burdens of government. There's a government program you're helping carry out to bring back business to a disaster damaged area. That can be a charitable activity. Combating community deterioration. This neighborhood's been destroyed and we want to see it recovered as a result. That can be a charitable activity. You're always going to have that last clause of that sentence, that the private benefit is only incidental to charitable purposes. A lot of weight gets put on the word incidental in our sector. And to me, I think what it means is any private benefit, the business is benefiting, it's a byproduct of the charitable good you're trying to do. It's not the purpose, right? It's a thing that happens along the way. It's not something you're trying to create. You're not doing this disaster relief because you really just want to stimulate the growth of local gas stations. It's really because it's the people who own the gas station that have been harmed, or somehow the gas station's employing many people in the community and they're all harmed. Those are when charity and business can intersect. Let me get some key concepts on how to do it wrong. Something you can't do is earmarking. Earmarking is almost always a bad word in our line of industry. So what you can't do is give to charity and say, hey, charity, you need to give it to this particular person who's been harmed by the disaster. Maybe that person's my friend, maybe it's a family member. I'm going to give it to you, but you have to give it to them. That doesn't work. That just because I told you at the beginning, when you give your coworker money, that's not a deductible gift. So you don't get to stick a charity in the middle and make them give it to your coworker. But the good news is you can give to that charity for providing disaster relief in your community. That community might include your friend, and your friend might end up getting that money. But you need that charity in the middle to not just be a pure conduit, a pass-through. These are all bad words we can use. The charity needs to have a moment in time where it decides who it's going to give it to, and it's going to give it to your friend, or maybe the neighbor to your friend, whoever they think, using their own processes for determining who it is. Charitable class needs to be sufficiently large or indefinite. So there's a lot of charities, or a lot of attempted charities, that have failed and been denied status or revoked by the IRS or accused of tax fraud when if you set up a one-person charity. So you may have a family member who's in financial need. If you set up a charity just for that person and to only serve that person, it's not a charity. That's sort of a fundamental principle of both state and federal law. Any sort of charity needs to operate for a large and indefinite group of people. This comes up in the context of disaster relief, not just because someone might try to set up a charity for their particular cousin or friend, but also because the IRS has said you can't have a charity for one disaster. You can, when you raise money, because if you raise money for one disaster, well, we already know who the people are, sort of a definite class of people that have been impacted by that disaster. It may end up being true that all the money you raise for disaster relief is used in the course of responding to the most recent hurricane or fire. But it can't be limited that way. So if you create a fund, you want to make sure you're raising money for disaster relief generally. And obviously you can, one of the things we're going to focus on is this particular hurricane, but you don't want to limit it, because if you run out of money, you need something else to spend it on. Or if you have money left over, you need something else to spend it on. And this last one is the kind of most interesting one. Not all victims of disaster are members of a charitable class, and you'll see there's this difference that's going to recur between short-term and long-term relief. Before I get into the weeds of it, let's just kind of talk through an example. There is a fire, a home is burning, the person comes out, they are in pain, and they need medical care. As that person approaches you, you notice that person is Elon Musk. Can you feed him, give him a blanket, help him put out the fire, put some bandages? Is that a charitable activity? Can you spend charity money on that? Well, the answer is yes. In that moment, yes, you can. And after that's over, you representing your charity or talking to Elon, he says, well, thank you so much. I see you're on a charity. Well, my house just burned down. Can I get some funds to rebuild my house? It's at that point where you need to say, wait, you're Elon Musk, you're the richest or second richest person in the world, depending on the price of Tesla that day. No, I can't. This is your charitable funds. Once you get past that sort of short-term moment, that moment of providing direct relief, it goes back to being about charity. And charity is generally about need, and need is generally about financial need. There are certain other kinds of charitable classes, but generally speaking, if you're not financially needy, you shouldn't be getting money from a charity. There's areas of charity where that's not true, for example, education, but when it comes to charity, when it comes to financial relief, you need to be a member of a charitable class. And so you'll want to be thoughtful if you're doing this. And this comes up more often than you think. I've worked with charities. There are any number of mass shootings over the past 2 years. And I remember one charity I was working with, I believe it was the Gilroy mass shooting, was talking about, hey, we want to provide relief to some of these people, and obviously we want to just pay for their medical care and pay for their homes, and it's really, well, that's great, but you need to get some W-2s, get some affidavits. Like, do they have the money? Could they pay for this themselves? And the sort of initial emotional reaction was, well, that's crazy. Why would we need to do that? They've just been in this horrible event. And then the answer is, yeah, but when it comes to charitable money, if they have the means to pay for it without your money, they're supposed to pay for it. You're not supposed to give charity money to people, even if something bad has happened to them. You can't give money. So sometimes it's thing that maybe makes sense from a big picture, but people sometimes get sideways about when it comes in practice. You have to ask people for financial information and provide relief, but that's how it works. When we talk about using a charitable vehicle, we're talking about using a regulated vehicle that has rules, and so this is one of the rules. And we can talk more about how that works as we go on to the next slide. Yeah, this gets to documentation. Riveting topic, I know, but where there are rules, there's documentation because you need to prove that you follow the rules, right? And this, you'll see, I won't go over line by line, but I have sort of the list of what the IRS thinks you need to do when it's long-term aid and what you need to do when it's short-term aid. You'll see the short-term aid at the bottom is significantly lower, right? It is shorter because it's just this. That's the documentation you need to keep when Elon came running out of his house. Look, we gave blankets, we gave some bandages. What were our criteria for dispersing assistance? They were obviously hurting. We're helping people in obviously the aftermath of the event. We did it on this date. We spent this money. That's really all you need to do on a short-term basis. Long-term, it gets into this issue I just talked about, which is you need to have some proof that you weren't giving money to Elon Musk or people who have plenty of money to pay for the relief themselves. And so you'll have this stuff about how they were selected. You want to make clear you'll need to keep records as to whether these people have a relationship to your directors and officers. It's not necessarily, we'll get more into it, but it's not really a strict prohibition to give to these people, but you need to make sure you're not formed to give to the family members of your directors. And I think we'll get more into the other ones as we go forward. So I think we can go to the next slide, but please come back to this. If you ever start a charitable activity, understand this is the documentation you have to keep. I probably should have walked through this at the beginning when I skipped over the outline. This was the useful thing to talk about, but I'm going to break the world of things you could set up for a charitable vehicle into 3 categories. And before I do that, I'll break the world of 501c3s into 2 categories. First, we all know what 501c3 is, but sometimes we lose track of there are really 2 kinds of 501c3s. There are public charities and there are private foundations. So public charities are charities that raise money from lots and lots of people. And they are the Red Cross, community foundations, lots and lots of other stuff. Also schools, hospitals, other things. When it comes to disaster relief, if we're talking about a charity, this is when we're talking about a company affiliated charity, this is a public charity that is affiliated with a particular company, but it's qualifying as a public charity because it receives donations from enough public people. Sometimes it's just this company has a lot of employees working from it and they all give. I've seen that be an example. Other times it's, the company started the charity, but it's actually kind of grown beyond the company and different people are giving to it. So if you have a company and you want to start a disaster relief fund, let's say you want to work with a company affiliated charity, this is going to be where the regulation is at its lowest. Why is that? Well, it's because public charities get the better end of the rules than private foundations. Private foundations are usually funded only by one family or one company, and therefore the IRS looks at them most skeptically because they don't have to answer to the public, they just have to answer to their company. So here, this is sort of the most flexible way to give. You'll see that if you want to set up an employer-specific fund, so this is a fund that is for the benefit for the benefit of people who've suffered from the disaster that are either employees of the company or family members of the employees in the company. You as an employer want to offer that and say, we're going to give $1 million to this fund. You do it at an affiliated charity. All you need to know is that the class of beneficiaries needs to be large or indefinite. So my law firm is 7 people. I don't think we could do one of these. I don't think we got a large enough charitable class to pull that off. If I were Coca-Cola, pretty sure we'd have more than enough people that employees of Coca-Cola and their family members, that's a very large group of people. Where the line is in between is always a little hard to say, but I wouldn't think of it as colossally large, maybe 50, 100 in that tier. You kind of want something at least that big. There's examples of that being a large enough charitable class. But if you're a small company, you should at least be asking that question before you start a fund that is only for 5 people, because that kind of violates the rule I just talked about, that you can't earmark for particular people. The recipients need to be based on an objective determination of need. Sometimes when you think about, obviously, everyone that is applying is presumably going to be in financial need as a result of the disaster. So it's going to be all that evaluation. I also want to emphasize what you shouldn't be doing. Whenever there's sort of a charitable fund that's tied to an employer, the IRS is looking out for this idea that what the fund is really doing is paying compensation to employees that it wants to reward and pay more, and that's not really about the disaster relief. And so when your charity is making these selections about who's going to get the money, you want to make sure it's really completely independent of that. And so one of the ways is, okay, what's your objective determination? They have this amount of money, these things happen to them, they have these bills to pay. That's great. One way to reinforce that is that if this is a company affiliated activity, you want an independent selection committee or similar procedures. And I would just say, just do a selection committee to make sure that the benefit to the employer is incidental and tenuous. If your selection committee are the 4 supervisors at the company that decide how much everyone gets paid, that seems like a bad idea to me. Those people are not going to be operating independently. They're going to be thinking about who are the good employees, who are the bad employees. Oh, we were just about to fire that person. Now I don't really want to give them money. This is not what's supposed to be happening with the disaster relief fund. It's not supposed to be a performance reward. So that's kind of what we mean by an independent committee. And we have this sort of rule that if a majority of the members of the committee consists of persons who are not in a position to exercise substantial influence over the affairs. So you want a majority what sometimes is called as a majority rank and file. If it's a majority of rank and file employees, people that don't have the power to influence pay, performance, bonuses, et cetera, that's probably a good sign. Often if you're working in connection with an existing charity, it'll be people who are I'd love to have it be a majority of the charity's employees serve as a committee. I'm sure they're going to listen a lot to the minority because they may know who the people are better, but I'd still rather have that buffer of majority control. So this is a company affiliated charity. And in some ways, this is the best option. It's also the hardest option to find. Why is that? Well, because usually there aren't a lot of company affiliated public charities. Generally speaking, the charities that are affiliated with companies are going to fall in the foundation category because the only people who are going to give to them are that company. Which means you're going to be more in this next set of rules as one of your options. Let me flip the slide here. Company foundation. So I probably spend about 50% of my time as an attorney for 501c3s talking about private foundations and the private foundation rules. One of them is self-dealing. So one of the consequences of being a company foundation or as a private foundation is that you're going to have self-dealing rules to follow. So this comes up, and this is consequential here because it means that if you get it wrong, when we're talking about a public charity, you get it wrong, there's not some direct consequence. What the self-dealing rules say is anytime the foundation uses its assets for the benefit of a disqualified person being the company or the people it owns or the directors or officers of the foundation, that's an act of self-dealing. Those people get hit with taxes, tax penalties, and they need to unwind the transaction. Well, the last thing you're trying to do in a disaster relief context is impose tax penalties on the people you're trying to help. So you want to make sure you're not violating the self-dealing rules as you do this. For a long time, the way the IRS describes it anyway, this sort of disaster relief by company foundations was more or less forbidden. It was assumed that it was self-dealing because, well, look, your company's foundation is only making grants to employees of your company. There must be some benefit to the company that's more than incidental, right? That was the theory. After 9/11, IRS softened these rules a bit to allow company foundations to set up more employee disaster relief funds. And the requirements are all basically the same as the ones we've just talked about: independent committee, charitable class, objective determination. But this is where they added the requirement that the relief be for a qualified disaster. So a federally declared disaster. So that's going to be a subset of the overall amount of bad things that can happen to your employees. If you have a public charity, that's generally going to be able to help for all kinds of disasters. And doesn't really, what does the disaster mean? It could just be for employees and their families in need. Once you get to it being company foundation, we have this extra requirement, and it's only for qualified disasters. I'll also just add, it makes following these rules even more important because getting it wrong is going to mean tax penalties on the people receiving the money potentially, or the company, and it's not what you want. I will note the couple of last bullets. The presumption does not apply to payments to disqualified persons. So if you set up a company foundation, I would take those directors and officers off the list of eligible recipients of aid. They're not supposed to be the ones getting it. And frankly, just generally speaking, most company foundations, the people on the board probably not in that financial need category, right? So they are probably not the ones to be receiving grants, and you have a prohibition. And the last point is just you can lose that presumption if you do other things that seem to be providing incidental benefit to the company. Like I said, I just be careful. Self-dealing is a hard rule to follow. It's something to violate. And I often just tell people, if you're operating this program in any way that's beyond just we want to help these people and their families, if you start factoring in things like who's a good employee, who's a bad employee, how much did someone get enough of a bonus this year, you're doing it wrong. And not only are you doing it wrong, but you're at risk of violating the self-dealing rules. So I'd be really careful about that. So the sort of intermediate option that we haven't talked about is a DAF or a fund and a charity, and that'll be the next slide. For those, I'm going to give you 30 seconds on what DAFs are, because they're super important in the charitable world, and a lot of people know what they are, but a lot of people don't. So a DAF is not a separate legal entity. It is not a separate charity unto itself. It's a little bucket of money at an existing charity. Sometimes the DAF lives at a place like Fidelity Charitable or Vanguard or Schwab Charitable, these sort of big charities that are associated with banks for philanthropists to drop some money in. In this context, it's probably more community foundations that will host DAFs, and community foundations might set up a fund. So you likely could go to your local community foundation and say, hey, we're an employer here in this community. I'm here in Los Angeles. Go to the California Community Foundation, which is our community foundation, say, hey, we're an employer here. We employ a lot of people in LA. We want to set up a disaster relief fund for our employees and their families. And now that would normally be a donor advised fund, because a donor advised fund is any fund at which the donor gets to continue saying where the money goes. And I'd probably toss this in that category if you're going to be on the committee saying where money's going, right? In those, generally DAFs can't make any grants to individuals at all. So when the DAF rules were first passed, this would have been prohibited entirely. Not long after they were passed, Treasury came out with an exception that said, okay, DAFs can make grants to individuals, or really technically something isn't a DAF, but you have to set up a separate fund, and it's got to follow all these rules. The key rule being you have to have the fund, and it's just for disaster relief, and it's just for qualified disasters. So just like foundations, you have that limit, that narrow limit. So this is something that pros and cons, let's talk them through. So the pro of doing a DAF, a company affiliated fund, an existing charity, a community foundation or otherwise, don't have to set up a legal entity, don't have to get tax exemption, you get to rely on theirs. The con, they're probably going to charge you a fee to administer it, and you'll have to follow these rules to get it set up properly. But otherwise, you'll see that basically everything is the same. You'll see that in addition to not benefiting directors or officers, it shouldn't benefit the sponsoring community foundation or whoever else is sponsoring the DAF. But basically the same idea. So we can to kind of recap these options. We have a public charity, company affiliated public charity, most flexibility if you can find one, but it's not easy to set up your own company affiliated public charity unless everyone loves your company and wants to give to support it. You're probably choosing between the second two options. You saw they both had this qualified disaster 139 requirement, federally declared disaster. And you saw they both come with these set of rules that basically force you, your company, to be in the minority of any selection committee. There's different schools of thought on how to staff it. You have the whole committee, but have rank and file. You can sort of follow these guidelines on how to do it. And what I would say is there's a number of community foundations that have done this. There's community foundations that work with other charities. I believe it's the Employer Assistance Fund is a good organization that both helps existing charities set up disaster relief funds for employers or sets up their own. This is an option. For some organizations, particularly if you're a company that expects to have some philanthropic goals, or employers that have philanthropic goals in the future, maybe you want to do a matching grant program, you might think about starting your own foundation. So I think the next slide, which I think is, if I'm remembering correctly, which is a really bad idea for me to ever go from memory, is the last on my part of it. Yeah, it looks like it. This would be, okay, what if you do want to set up your own foundation? Now, normally, we'll get to the bottom why this isn't unrealistic to do in terms of timing. But the basic steps for following, I always set up nonprofit corporations. It is possible to set up charities as a trust. I think for me, corporations, especially for something in like the company foundation context, often works a bit better. But both are options. Let's assume that you're doing a nonprofit corporation. You're gonna need to have articles of incorporation. You're gonna need to have bylaws. You're gonna need to have a conflict of interest policy. So the articles of incorporation is what the person who's creating it files to bring the organization into existence. I always tell people, you can do that in 24, 48 hours. That can happen right away if you want to get a charity up and running to do this. You'll do the bylaws, and in the bylaws, you'll think about how the board is going to be appointed. Well, that's super important for a company foundation. You could have it be so that the board of this foundation is wholly appointed by the company. So the company just gets to say who's on the board from time to time. So it's a company controlled entity. Nobody owns a charity. You can't own a nonprofit, but you can control a nonprofit. And typically you're setting a company foundation. That's what you want. So you're going to spend a little bit of time on the bylaws to make sure you do that right. You're going to pass a conflict of interest policy, in part to follow your corporate law rules about insider transactions. But for me, it's when I'm talking to a foundation, it's usually about, here's all the things you need to know about the self-dealing rules, or at least here's enough to know that you need to take these really seriously so you're not stuck paying a bunch of tax penalties to the IRS. When done right, planning ahead, easy to manage those rules. Going in ignorant, bad things happen. You'll need an action of sole incorporated. That's typically where the initial board is appointed, the initial officer, who's going to sign, all that stuff. Do your initial filings with your state authority. I'm in California, where there's lots of people to register with. In Florida and other states, you're probably going to find a few less things to register with. You might just need to register with the Secretary of State. Once that's all done, and like this is all stuff that can be done in a matter of days if you're motivated and trying to get your company foundation up and running. The next thing is the tax exemption application. I want to come back to that public charity operating foundation, private foundation thing, because I can't help myself, even though it's a bit tangential. I would say the main thing you're going to be looking at is we're going to file a Form 1023. There is something known as the Form 1023-EZ. That's only an option for organizations that expect to make $50,000 or less in the first 3 years. These are generally turned around a little bit faster, and sometimes people feel tempted to use it to get a faster response. But to be clear, you're not eligible for it unless you expect to only make $50,000 a year or less. And frankly, if you're expecting that to put that little money into the foundation, you're probably better off just doing a fund with a community foundation. My personal takeaway, I will say the even better in terms of expediting than the EZ is being able to expedite for one of the specific bases that the IRS allows. Usually it's pretty hard to expedite. You have to be able to show that if we don't get this determination letter by this date, we're going to lose funding that will really hurt us. Now, some people manage to always find that friendly donor that's willing to say that, but you don't need to rely on that here. And the good news about setting up a disaster relief fund is that's a basis for expediting your exemption application. You can tell the IRS this is our plan to establish this, and they'll expedite the application. How fast is expedited? I don't know, a month, 5 weeks. Sometimes it comes back in a week. The IRS is a mysterious place now more than ever. But I do think that it should. This is like if you got to the end of this presentation and your conclusion as a company or this company I'm advising, like the right thing to do is to set up a foundation. You can actually. This is one situation where you can move things fairly quickly. And I think with that, I'll pause my part of the presentation. I will hang around, and that way, if questions come up at the end that I could answer, I'd be happy to. But thanks again for inviting me, Alan. I always enjoy it.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I think the one thing I would mention is that if you set up the foundation this week and get a tax ID number, you can start taking deductions before you have clearance from the IRS.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. And so you can start operating as a charity as soon as you file the articles, and you can accept money as soon as you file the articles and get an EIN and a bank account. The only limit on what you can do before you get a determination letter is what you can tell people. So you can't tell people we are a 501c3. We can tell people we applied to be a 501c3. We have no reason to doubt we'll get it. And it will be retroactive to the date we formed, such that your gift will be deductible if and when it's approved. But it took a couple more seconds for me to say than just we're a 501c3. But other than that, yeah, you can and should start operating. And there's really if you do it right, there's really no reason to doubt you will get the letter. So if the company is the initial donor, that's usually a good basis. And or you have friendly kind of key individuals, key directors, officers that are going to be making the initial donations, And that's a pretty easy thing to make a leap of faith on.
Yeah, and then before you start fundraising in most states, you'll file with the Secretary of State and just let them know that you're there. It's a simple
Yeah,
app.
the Secretary of State and depending on the state, the Attorney General. I know Florida has a solicitation requirement, but it's not the Attorney General. It's somewhere else. In most states, it's your local Attorney General.
Florida,
Right.
Florida is actually the Department of Agriculture.
That was my memory. Yeah.
Yeah.